During the morning services, we're busy with Paul's letter to the congregation of Philippi. And we have progressed up until the 12th verse. And I would like to share some thoughts with you from verse 12 and also verse 13. Well, today you actually have to remember 3 words. It's a very short sermon. So once we have learned these 3 words, we can go home. Not so easy, because pastors usually want to speak a lot more. But 3 words. You only have to know 3 words to know what today's message is all about. And those are the words, to, in, and through. To, in, and through. Well, let me get you into the secret of what these words are all about. These words actually are a message that Paul, in his life's philosophy of what is happening to him, or what has happened to him up until that point, and what will happen to him in the future, he made up a life's philosophy. And this is it. Things happen to you so that things can happen in you, so that things can happen through you. Things happen to us so that things can happen in us, so that things can happen through us. Let me explain. If we look at the congregation to which Paul wrote his letter, it was a congregation that was started 10 years prior to this letter. The congregation was started round about in the year 51 after Christ. And it started with a bang. The big bang of the church. It started with a revival. It started with wonderful, miraculous things happening. And 10 years after that, in this city, in this little congregation, things went wrong. Horribly wrong. They were faced with life-threatening challenges. Will God see them through? Will they survive? What's going to happen to them? Not only were there problems from the outside, as I told the 10 o'clock service, to be in that city, a Christian, was not easy. Philippi was a Roman colony city. The people there tried to be more Roman than the Romans. The Roman customs were observed. And to be a Christian there was absolutely not easy. Their children lost their places in the school. It was not easy to find a job because if you're a Christian, you will not bow before the Caesar. You will not bow before the leader of that time, before Caesar. And so you might lose your job. It was not easy from the outside. They were sort of forced to be a community on their own. And now the problems are not from the outside, but from the inside. Division from the outside you can withstand, but division from the inside is very, very difficult to withstand. And so they face all these problems. And the question is, will God see us through? Is this work God's work? And now Paul writes this letter. And he writes a letter as a friendship's letter. It's not the letter of the Apostle Paul to this congregation, but it's a letter of a friend. And he writes about his own experiences. Looking through this letter and reading through it, you find the word joy many times. It is as if this was a piece of sunshine that they opened up in that maybe very dark room where they were gathered. When they read the letter, maybe they were expecting dark words, but there's words that were like sunbeams. But it was not cheap words. These words were not cheap words of, please trust the Lord and we pray for you, and all those kinds of words that we sometimes say to one another, not meaning it. Paul's words weigh like gold. It were heavy words spoken. And so Paul reflects on his own journey. He brings in his own story. And he says to them, I want to report to you, friends, that my imprisonment here, so remember he was in prison. So he writes from prison to another congregation, not physically in prison, but in a certain sense they were also in prison. So he writes to them, he says, I want to report to you, friends, that my imprisonment here has had the opposite of its intended effect. In some other translations it was translated as that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. And he uses two beautiful Greek words. The one word that he uses is erchomai. Erchomai means, and he puts that in the perfect tense. He says, it started somewhere. It's going on, and it will go on. What I experience is not something that's finished. It's done. It has started. It's going on, and it will go on. And then he uses a second word, proskope. Proskope was a word they used for pioneer woodcutters preceding a regular army. He says, well, what is happening to me is like a pioneer woodcutter. It goes ahead and it opens a new way. What I experience here is like someone in the woods, someone in the forest who doesn't know precisely what is ahead, but as he goes forward, he is opening a new way. So he says to them, in his life, he found out the amazing truth, the amazing life's philosophy, that things are happening to him, so that things can happen in him, so that things can happen through him. Let's, for one moment, reflect on what has happened to Paul. Now here in the congregation of Philippi and in the letter to this congregation, he just mentions his imprisonment. But if you look at 2 Corinthians 11, there's quite a list. Paul says there, I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. Quite an adventurous life. I think if he had been a person trying to find a job, and his prospective manager would have told him, well, this is what your job will entail, being flogged. You have to run for your life, being stoned. I don't know how many of us would say yes to this. 3 times I was beaten with rods, and he says, I was shipwrecked 3 times. I spent a day and night on open sea. And all of that, it's danger upon danger, and all without pay. My goodness, whom of us would do that? And Paul says, all of these things happen to me. That's part of my life. It's not just something that happened. It is happening and it will happen. So he has good news and he has bad news. The bad news is, congregation of Philippi, bad things do happen. Good news, when bad things happen to us, good things can happen in us. That's the good news. What happened in him? Well, if you look at his letter just a few verses on, he talks about that. He says, so how I am to respond to the things that happen to me. He says, I have decided that I really don't care about their motives. And he talks about people proclaiming the gospel for their own profit. He says, whether mixed, bad, or indifferent, every time one of them opens his mouth, Christ is proclaimed. And then he carries on with this fantastic verse, for me life is Christ and death is gain. Paul, what happened in you? And it's here. It's here that we have to go back into the life of Paul. You see, in Paul's life, there was a death and a resurrection. I have died with Christ. You see, when things need change, it changes through death and resurrection. Somehow Paul understood what we experience now in the time of Lent, when we celebrate Christ's death and also on Easter morning, his resurrection. That's what happened inside of him. I have died with Christ. It's no longer I that live, but Christ in me. And this concept of Christ in me is like a refrain. It's repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated again and again and again. Death and resurrection. You see, for Paul to be able to say this, he had to experience a death to himself. A death to his own self-centeredness, to be able to say, my life is Christ-centered. To be able to say, I can do anything through Christ who lives in me. That's his secret. I can do anything through the all-energizing power of Jesus Christ, who has been resurrected in my life. That is amazing. Paul, how can you write a letter like this, a letter of victory, a letter of joy? Because old Paul is dead. And the one who lives is the one who gets his energy, who gets his perspective from the all-living, and the resurrected Christ. We do like change as long as we don't have to change, don't we? We want change in our lives just as long as we don't have to change on the inside. So Paul, what happened? When the old Paul died, the perspective of the new Paul started to rise. New perspective. It's not only about Paul, it's not only about him and his career and his fortune. No. He got the bigger picture. He saw the possibilities. He saw the possibility in the proclaiming of the gospel. There were people proclaiming the gospel in a different way than what he did and what the Philippians did. And it was upsetting for them. And he said, no, in any case, Christ is proclaimed, and I rejoice in that. Furthermore, I celebrate it. To have a different perspective. To see things differently through resurrection eyes. He could increase other people's possibilities. I think this congregation saw things much differently after they saw it through his eyes. To see it in that light, it helps you to rise above the average. It gives you energy, and it keeps you from giving up. Paul, who says, I can do anything through Christ. Now, to him, in him, and through him. And this is very exciting. Paul was there in prison, and every 4 hours they had to change the guard. And there were 4 guards. So every 4 hours he had 4 other people. And can you imagine in Paul's presence? I don't think he was a very quiet prisoner. So he was talking all the time. And every time there are new guards, he was talking to them. What opportunity. He had access to a whole mission field. He had access to people that he never would have had if it was not for being in prison. He found gain in loss. You see, brothers and sisters, we cannot control the wind, but we can adjust our sails. He found gain in loss. I would like to close. One of the highlights of my ministry, and I had many highlights, but one of the highlights of my ministry was the last Sunday of December when we had when we served communion to Peter Venter. You remember Peter Venter? We had him here. And you remember Peter's story. He was suffering from cancer. And this service was his very last service that he attended on earth. He passed away about a month ago. But Peter's story is one of those remarkable stories. It reminds me of Paul. Peter was a very successful lawyer. He studied law and he received his doctorate in law. And he was really successful. And then everything went wrong. Things start happening to him that were really, really bad. He lost everything. in a very short matter of time, he lost his practice, he lost so many things. And on top of that, he lost his wife, he was divorced, and he came to Korea, and he had in South Africa, he stored some of his very valuable paintings that were worth many thousands of rands. He stored at his daughter's house, and his daughter's house burned down. Everything gone. And then on top of that, they found out that he had cancer. And we know the story of the cancer. And I was fortunate to interview Piet. The first time I met him, I was asked to visit him and to meet with him because he had cancer. And I was expecting to really have a pastoral conversation with him about his illness and about death and so on. But I was amazed. He was so full of life. The first time I met him, he had this big hat on, and he was walking around with a camera, and he was shooting everything. And he was talking with everybody. And he just had this immense energy, positive energy. And then I learned so much from him. Because what happened to him made a change in him. A ministry that he never had became apparent. And the ministry that he had for the rest of his life when he suffered from cancer, he reached so many thousands of people all over the world with his message of hope. How to live with cancer. How to live every moment of the day. And thousands of people were touched by his inner spirit, his life with Christ. He experienced Christ in such a new way, but it cost him that death with Christ and resurrection with Christ, to see things in a totally new way. The messages when he passed away were so positive, of a person who touched the lives of so many people. And when I was preparing for this sermon, it just came so, Peter's face just came in front of me, saying, that is the kind of work that God does. To us, things happen. In us, things should happen. And when that happens, things will happen through us. In us, to us, through us. Amen.
Now all you rise up, if possible.